Welcome to Trending in Education. Mike Palmer here. I'm joined today by Dr. C. Edward Watson, who's the Associate Vice President for Curricular and Pedagogical Innovation and Executive Director of OER and Digital Innovation at the American Association of Colleges and Universities, also known as AAC&U. He's the co-author of a really interesting new book called Teaching with AI, a practical guide to a new era of human learning. Eddie, welcome to Trending in Education.
Thank you so much, Michael. I appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to chat with you.
Yeah, well, like I said when we were first catching up, your book is zeitgeisty. It is very much something that is catching a wave. Folks are trying to figure out, what does AI mean in all these different industries, but in particular, we're focused on education, and folks are maybe grappling with the practical aspect. And I was very happy to see in your title that this is designed to be a practical guide, and it's designed to really give folks a compass for navigating turbulent water, to extend the metaphor. We'll get into all that in a bit, but before we do that, we always like to start by getting to know you a little bit. Can you catch our listeners up on your origin story as a learning professional?
Yes, I was a first generation college student. I grew up in the mountains of Virginia, worked my way through college, got double degrees as an undergraduate in statistics and English. Yeah, that didn't make sense to many people, probably not me either, but I just made it through to the end, but ended up getting a doctorate in instructional design and technology from
Hmm.
Virginia Tech.
Go
So faculty.
Hokies.
Yeah, go Hokies. That's very correct. So I was on faculty there for 15 years before leaving for the University of Georgia, where I served as the director of the Center for Teaching and Learning there. But 7 years ago, I left Georgia and joined AAC&U. So I've been doing this work now for, like I said, 7 years, focusing on issues of quality and equity in higher education. My portfolio focuses on general education reform and then a range of digital innovations such as open educational resources and e-portfolios, strategies that have a lot of evidence supporting their practice, but then also emerging technology such as artificial intelligence, which led to the book and some new programming that we've launched at the association.
Yeah, that's fantastic. You're a higher ed futurist. I love having futurists on the show. You get bonus points for that. So thank you for your service. And then AI is something futurists have been talking about for a while. We've been talking about it. This show started in 2016, and one of the first trends we were talking about was artificial intelligence. You start the book out with a chronology of artificial intelligence, and I was really struck by, within your timeline there's many more milestones that have been hit recently, and there is this impression, I think this feeling that we're all getting, that things have been accelerating, in particular since the launch of ChatGPT 3.5 back in November of 22, 18 months ago, something like that. And my gosh, things have changed. Can you catch us up, just framing wise, on like where we are in terms of AI? And then I think we'll get into some of what you put out there just around the structure of the book, which I really like, which is thinking with AI, teaching with AI, and learning with AI. But can you characterize the problem space and really what drove you and Jose to write this book?
Yeah, I think that there were a couple of epiphanies that I've had. So I guess the first was, as you might imagine, I have a college age son. That's who introduced me to Chat GPT. Within a couple of weeks when it came out, and
Mhm.
he was describing to me what it does and how it functions, and I was like, yeah, I don't really believe that. And then one weekend he was home and he showed me, and he has memorialized that my first words were, "Oh no."
I wasn't
Because
sure if you're going to be able to keep it clean. I was ready for another "oh" something, but "oh no" works too. Yeah.
No, because I could see the academic integrity challenges. I saw
Mm,
instantly, like, "Oh, this
mhm.
is gonna be a problem for
Yeah.
higher ed."
Mhm.
Then, as I began to really kind of investigate and then see what some possible opportunities might be, I guess what really motivated me to want to write a book in this space was recognizing that this was unique among the innovations that I had experienced in my 30-year career.
Yeah.
I think you described me as a futurist. I'm pretty accurate, but it's often because I'm a boring futurist. Like I was on a panel 10 or 12 years ago during the MOOC revolution.
Right.
And, the question was posed to the panelists, what's higher ed going to look like in 5 years? And one of the futurists on the panel said, we will have fewer than 50 institutions of higher learning left in the United States.
Wow.
And I thought, well, I'm at the other end of that. So when I was asked, I said, higher is going to look a lot like it does right now. And we'll
Right.
figure out a space where this will have meaning and usefulness, but we're still going to have, all the same colleges and
Yeah.
universities that right now. So I've always,
Hmm.
I sort of look at strength of treatment, like how big is this and what's the
Mm.
shift that we could anticipate. But
Yeah.
I guess I saw 2 things that made me sort of shift away from my typical, like, "Well, this really isn't gonna change things much," to, like, "This actually is significant."
Yeah.
Certainly, the academic integrity challenge and what
Yep.
students can do with it led me to believe, well, ultimately, regardless of discipline, there's gonna have to be some rethinking regarding assignments and what student writing
Yeah.
looks like and how students might collaborate with it. But
Right.
then that's sort of like the grassroots pressure up on faculty and
Yeah, you
administrators.
talk a lot about assignments and assessments and the impact on writing and the impact on grading and evaluating all this stuff. That's huge.
Yes. And so the additional piece was the rapid adoption of AI for a variety of different purposes in the world of work.
Yep.
So it isn't just that we need to reconsider our practices in response to what students might be doing with it, but rather we need to also be teaching AI literacies,
Yep.
knowledge, competencies, skills, abilities with AI to prepare students for the life that awaits them beyond college. So these were
Right.
two pressures. One is outside the institution and one is
Yep.
in our classroom right in front of us. And I
Mm.
and those two together and just like employer surveys and the rapid adoption of AI across really every field. I mean,
Right.
you can't it's hard to name a field that hasn't been touched already, whether you're
Right.
talking PR or HR or
Mm.
legal or medical. I
Yeah.
mean, AI has had a rapid adoption and also certainly generative AI. So as a result of that, if higher ed, part of its mission is to prepare students for life beyond college, well, then as an essential learning outcome for higher education,
Yeah.
AI must quickly become one.
Right. Right. That's interesting. So those two forces are almost pushing in different directions, right? So on the one hand,
Right.
how do you control this new technology and make sure it doesn't upset the status quo? But then on the other hand, seeing where these students are ultimately going to seek a professional life, you do understand that you're going to have to do some adoption, have to do some integration of all that. And then I like the outline too, where in some ways, it does dovetail with what you're describing, where thinking with AI is really what all of us need to do. And that's certainly the responsibility in higher ed, but it's also lifelong learners, K-12, early childhood ed. How do we grapple with this new technology? How do we get better by using it and also understand a lot of the risks therein? But then getting into teaching with AI and learning with AI, I feel like you kind of map out a whole ecosystem, but then you're also trying to be practical along the way. So, can you maybe kick off the conversation a little bit if folks are trying to understand within higher ed specifically, how are you thinking about some of that stuff? Maybe beginning with, thinking with AI. Any thoughts on how you'd want to introduce some of these ideas?
Yeah, I think that the different sections in the title of the book. One word that we played with quite a bit was the word "with." Like,
Mm,
what does "with" really mean?
mm,
And if you think about, well, I built something with a hammer and nail. They're tools that you're employing,
yeah.
which is certainly one way to kind of think about teaching with AI or learning with AI. But
Mm,
we really see it as actually a collaboration. So
mhm,
it's like I did this podcast with Michael. I mean,
yeah.
we're working together, and so that's a different kind of positioning than say like traditional learning technology tools. This
Right.
is actually something that you can collaborate with, that your
Right.
students will collaborate with, and
Mhm,
we really see this as the future. I guess the futurist piece for me that it feels compelling that this is a shift is that we will be collaborating with generative AI tools going forward, that this is a significant shift in the way
mhm.
that we learn, the way that we think, the way that we create.
Yeah. And it is that notion of a co-pilot, of a dance partner, use whichever metaphor. I guess I used the nautical one before, maybe a first mate, but like you have someone along with you for the ride. And then if you're open to the upside of that type of engagement, it does open up new solutions, new ways to work better. I think of it as like a floor raising technology if we manage some of the inherent bias and other challenges that we've had around these types of technologies. But you also talk about, reimagining creativity. How are you thinking about that? Because it does feel like, we're kind of shook as a species right now, where we invented something that is sort of impinging on our turf to some extent. And we almost need to rethink, okay, how do we fit into this landscape nowadays? How does that relate to creativity?
Well, I think if you think about committees you may have worked on in the past, and so like if you're brainstorming a new product or a new workshop or new programming, around the table, you might get three or four good ideas. There's a lot of self editing that we do because we're like, well, the person with his arms folded in the
Yeah.
front, I'm not sure how they're going to react to this. So maybe I'll edit or hold it back.
Yeah.
And then, once you get three or four ideas out there, you kind of gravitate toward an idea and then you run with it.
Yeah.
And, research from the D School at Stanford suggests to have like a great product idea, you need not 100 ideas or 1,000 ideas. They estimate it's about 2,000 ideas that you need
Hmm.
to then have one really great idea in the midst of that. So
Hmm.
we're not really good at generating lots of ideas. We generate good ideas,
Yeah.
but if I ask you, give me 100 ideas for a new product at Trader Joe's,
Yeah.
100 ideas, that would be really hard,
Hmm.
but it's super easy and super quick for an AI to
Hmm.
do that.
Yeah.
So keeping in mind that the notion is with that you're working
Yeah.
with it. I mean, one of the false binaries that frustrates me is I hear people say, "Well, why would I let AI do that for me?" And it's like,
Right.
"Well, that's you wouldn't. That's not how this is supposed to work. What you're
Mm.
supposed to be doing is you collaborate with it. You give it a prompt. It gives you a set of things, but then you're lead author. You
Yeah.
choose what to move forward with. So if you needed 100 ideas, I bet when you review those ideas within the context of your work, it's like, well, geez, most of these aren't any good, but hey, there's three or four really good that I could combine.
Right.
And they're often way outside of the box because AI is not going to be socially inhibited by those in the room.
Yeah.
So as a collaborator for doing something better, even in the process of creation, it's a great partner.
Yeah. That's amazing. I remember talking about this in the context of distinguishing between idea generation and idea selection, where frequently, the problem is in a large organization, if the folks at the top of the food chain are doing both, it's a problem. It's an engagement problem within the rest of the organization because, wait, they get to do everything. But if instead you can widen the aperture for the idea generation and then hold on to the selection for the top, that winds up working pretty well. And then it also allowed me to make a lot of bad idea pitches where I'm a big believer in bad ideas are the mulch from which good ideas bloom. So it seems like the BS engine that folks sometimes refer to these LLMs as, it's got to be good at brainstorming. So that's some examples. You have a lot in there. I think, AI literacy is the other thing in terms of thinking with AI. How do you understand AI literacy? How do we think about teaching AI literacy?
I think there's a variety of different components that comprise AI literacy. So overarching, there's this notion of digital equity. Number one, having access to be able to engage. But
Hmm.
then once you sort of get to the point of investigating, what does that refer to? Well, there's some digital literacy, there's information literacy, there's critical thinking. That's a
Hmm.
key component of it. Depending on what you're trying to produce, I mean, communication skills,
Yeah.
writing, editing skills would be a component of
Yeah.
that. Also, there's just functional knowledge of the landscape and understanding when you would select one tool over the
Hmm.
other because there are more than a half a dozen different large scale large language models,
Yeah.
LLMs, out there,
Hmm.
and they do things differently, and they one does one task better than another, and as you play with them and you sort of know the way that you work and the work that you need them to do, like I find that for me, whenever I'm looking for a partner for idea generation and
Yeah.
creating with, I think Claude tends to be a more creative partner for me
Hmm.
than say ChatGPT 4.
Yep.
Yeah, so I think it's there's a suite of things out there. It's not monolithic where AI is this one thing. You
Yeah.
kind of have to know what the strengths and weaknesses are and then know which tool to pick up and when.
Yeah. We just finished up our March Madness contest of learning trends. And I think the 11th seed, which didn't do anything, was LLM relationship status, colon, it's complicated. meaning I ain't got no rings on my fingers. Claude and I are spending a lot of time together, but I'm hearing this is true. I am hearing that Gemini is pretty good in terms of being creative. So, to your point, like I think we should all be kind of playing the field. And then the other equity issue related to that is, the enterprise level, the paid subscription levels of all these tend to be the real superchargers. And not everyone has access to that. A lot of higher ed is now looking to provide access to the more premium experience of the LLMs as almost like a policy decision that's out there. That's getting a little more into the second section, which is teaching with AI. How do you think about it? How much can you control it? How much can you limit cheating and some of the plagiarism risks that are out there? And then, how can you kind of design a space where your students are actually preparing for that future of work that you were describing? How should we think about teaching with AI?
Well, it's interesting. Whenever I go to campuses, there's a shift that's taking place, and I'm grateful that it's shifting. But it's initially been a real focus on what do I do about student cheating?
Yep.
And the challenge with AI detection as a solution to that is multifaceted. People ask me, well, you've played around with these things. Does AI detection work? And it's like, does it work? What's better than
Right.
you and I mean, if we try to look at different writing samples, one study suggests that faculty get it right 54% of the time. That's a large failure rate.
Yeah.
And you talk to some faculty and they're like, I think they're all cheating. Like, and I read it, I think I hear the same voice. And
Right.
which they may be right,
Yeah.
but AI detection definitely has a better success rate than us.
Right.
But there's still significant false positives, even with the best of show tools. So if you ask
Yeah.
me, does it work? Sort of, yeah, as an anecdotal tool, like it'll probably give you a sense of like, but if you were going to run a student through the academic integrity process with
Yeah.
a tool that has a rate of false positives, this is highly problematic. I mean,
Right.
if you think about your time in college,
Mhm.
I think I would rather have earned an F in a class than to be falsely accused of cheating and ran through that process.
For
And
sure. Yeah.
yeah, so I think I don't think that we can use these tools as part of our academic integrity process. The collateral damage is too great. And you look at concerns about, the student well-being crisis, as well as declining confidence in higher education in general across the public writ large. I mean,
Right.
there are damaging consequences to higher ed as an industry and to individual students by employing a solution that has these kinds of outcomes. What I typically advise campuses, I say, okay, if you're still thinking about using this, if you're not willing to be transparent with your students about the false positive rate,
Yeah.
you probably shouldn't use the tool.
Mhm.
And that's often where the conversation concludes. It's like, yeah, you're right. I don't
Right.
want to tell them that there's a 6% or a 4%
Right.
false positive rate because that's significant. And,
Right.
many institutions turned off their Turnitin subscription back in September whenever Turnitin revealed that their false positive rate was 4 times as high as they initially thought it was.
Right.
So yeah, that's not the solution. So then back to your initial question about teaching with AI, what is the solution? And there was a brief period in the fall where people were talking about AI resistant assignments. And I saw some of these posted online. And as a former CTL director, former teacher, I was like, hey, this is problematized in a really interesting way.
Mm.
But then we did focus groups with students and we put these assignments in front of students and they were like, oh no, I know how I would do this. I would start with this AI and do that. And then I have a comparative graph with this AI.
Right.
So they could produce it in 90 seconds. So the
Right.
solution
I also
is
wanna hire that kid, which is a separate topic.
right, yeah, because they had AI literacies.
Yeah.
So what can you do that would then diminish the chances that students would choose to cheat within your courses? And we have lots of suggestions within the book, but just a couple of examples that are just structural. Most students don't want to cheat. It's often because circumstances drive them to it. So you imagine, well, like me, a first generation college student who worked 20 to 30 hours a week, to pay their way through college. I had something due Sunday night at midnight in the learning management system, and I worked 16 hours that weekend.
Yeah.
So now I'm under pressure. I didn't manage my time as well as I could have, and now I'm under pressure. So maybe I would opt to
Yeah.
cheat in some form.
Mhm.
But if on your syllabus, if you got 5 papers due in your class, maybe give students the option to get a 48-hour extension on 2 out of those 5 assignments. No questions asked. Just email me and say, I want those extensions,
Mm,
and you'll give it to them. And so then students will do the work. Which means they're actually engaging in the learning process.
right.
So just some flexibilities that would diminish the where students feel like their backs are against the wall and they must indeed cheat, because the vast majority of our students are not the traditional model of, hey, all live on campus and they
Mhm.
all are taking classes and none of them are working. There's a lot of working students out there. So that's just one thing
Yeah.
that would diminish the chances that students would cheat.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me, you talk also about designing for human effort. Like there's the dystopian possibility of Wally, right? Where like we're all using AIs to kind of do shortcuts and we become flabbier both physically and also intellectually because we have this crutch that we can lean on too much. That's a risk, but if you're designing to kind of buy into maybe some of that motivation problem, and you were even talking before about maybe a trust problem that's out there as well, trying to connect with these rising learners and, have them embrace some of the ethic of actually putting in the work to get better. How are you thinking about that?
Well, I mean, the one who does the work is the one who does the learning. So I
Mhm.
think building, designing to encourage students to actually engage in the work, whether it's providing flexibilities or rethinking maybe what the outcomes were. You said something maybe 15, 20 minutes ago about sort of like the floor being raised.
Yeah.
And I think that what was once C work, we might need to reconceptualize as F work.
Yeah.
If what AI can produce we now see is F, well, then what is it that students should then be adding to the conversation? There's a model that's well known in higher ed circles or teaching and learning circles writ large, certainly K-20 circles. It's something called Bloom's taxonomy. It's been around since the 50s. It's been revised at least once.
Mhm.
But when you look at this pyramid, like at the top, the highest order learning outcome in the original model is the notion of evaluation, to be able to look at something and make a quality judgment and then make adjustments to it.
Mhm.
So if that's at the top of the pyramid, AI is not real good at doing that right now. That's the human component. That's what A work looks like. Is you
Mm.
if you had a product that AI produced, that's C work or the new F work, because everyone can produce it, so that's below average,
Right.
really.
Right.
Well, then what's the human piece that's brought in? And it's being able to make evaluative adjustments, to be able to make appropriate edits. How do you improve the product? I mean, that's really, I think, maybe the top of an AI literacy pyramid is the notion of having those evaluative skills, recognizing quality, recognizing flaws in logic, flaws
Yeah.
in data, hallucinations, and ending up with a better final product than you could have produced by yourself. I think
Mhm.
that's ultimately the opportunity that's presented here, and certainly the skill set that we should be developing in students in many, many disciplines.
Yeah, I love that. I've heard it described as discernment and also perhaps your executive function, where you want to be leading the AIs, not being led by them necessarily. You don't want to be, Kevin Roos's book, Future Proof. He basically says you don't want to be an endpoint. Like an Uber driver is the example there, where you don't want to be just the human who is connecting what the AIs are telling us to do. There are dystopian scenarios out there. This is in some ways a call to action. I imagine it is. You are saying as I guess, a conservative futurist in the sense that you have been maybe thinking some of these changes are overstated or overblown. When you talk about higher ed, there's also demographic challenges and the questioning of the value of the institution, questioning of the costs of the institution.
Indeed.
How do you think AI may either help or hurt higher ed navigate was already, pretty turbulent seas?
It's a really good question. Like, I don't necessarily see opportunities where AI is going to decrease the cost of education. I do see a massive amount of opportunities where the quality of higher education can be improved, that there will be equity strategies that will result, more equitable opportunities for student learning. Just as an example, whenever I'm teaching and I explain a concept, a difficult concept, and a student raises a hand and says, I didn't quite follow that. Help me, could you explain this further? And then I find that I would use kind of the same language and the same metaphors that I used previously, to explain it, and which how's that helpful, but it's my, I'm in the groove of my discipline. And so I'm still talking that way. And one
Yeah.
time I had a student in the front listen to my second explanation and say, No, no, no. What he's saying, it's like that Beyonce song where blah 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 blah, and
Yeah,
everyone starts nodding, and then the student next to him who raised the question said, "Oh, I get it now." And I was like, "What just happened in the classroom?"
right.
One thing, it's like the value of collaborative learning, but as an example of increasing quality, helping understanding, is you can ask AI for a litany of examples regarding the topic. So, like if you're talking about biodiversity, give me an example of a metaphor that describes biodiversity using March Madness. I
Sure.
recorded. Or give me an example that relates to the movie Barbie, or give me an example that relates to, whatever city we might be in. And so
Yeah.
then you have these array of examples and metaphors that you can then use that would be accessible to a variety of different students.
Mm-mm.
Give me examples that the average 18-year-old would clearly understand.
Yeah.
Or as a student, I can do exactly the same thing. Like, wow, so, Professor Palmer was talking about X in class and I didn't get it. Ask AI, could you teach me this?
Right.
And ask, could you use a metaphor that has to do with things that I care about and that I know deeply, that I richly understand?
Yeah.
That can help level some things for students with, a variety of different backgrounds and preparedness levels for college courses.
Yeah. So, as a futurist, you've now hit on something that I like to talk about. This is the idea of personal virtual assistants. So, the idea that we'll all have a custom version of Siri, a custom version of ChatGPT or Claude that knows all of our quirks and knows how we like to understand things and knows perhaps how to challenge and motivate us. Do you see that on the horizon? And if so, how do you think that might factor into modeling what a classroom of the future might be?
Yes, I think we're kind of close there now. I mean, you can upload, documents that have your voice and then say, "Hey, I need you to write me a letter to the editor that uses idioms that I often use,
Yeah.
that reference my hometown, and so then you'll get a product that more or less resembles your voice, and then you can edit it."
Yeah.
So, I mean, with direction, it currently does it. I think that maybe the idealized version is where you don't have to train it any longer, where,
Mm.
it's prepped and the next time you turn it on.
Yep.
We're not far from that. I imagine that this is indeed part of the near future, a scenario that we can certainly expect and anticipate. But, there are already tools that maybe aren't customized to you, but they're customized to disciplines or
Mm.
customized to specific disciplines or content sets.
Yep.
When you and I were talking about open educational resources, there's a group right now that's building an LLM in Canada that's based just on the OpenStax
Ah,
textbook set.
that's
So, if you're
mm.
taking a biology class that's using the OpenStax textbook, it
Yeah.
can tutor you around the content within that
Yeah.
book. So it's getting closer. And I think that right now, it may not be individualized to me and the breadth of my interests and
Yep.
understanding the way that my wife understands me. But there's certainly context or needs that we have that people are already customizing,
Yeah.
often using the open API that gains access to the Chat GPT large language model, these customizations that do very specific tasks,
Yeah.
within disciplines or languages or whatever it might be.
Yeah. I love the connection to OER too, because that does address some of the challenges of the LLMs in that you don't really know where it's coming from. This is also where, you see people talking about rags now, where like you have a way to kind of federate against an actual, you know, set of policies. There was a problem in New York City recently where the chatbot was telling landlords they could do things they can't really do and telling business owners that, oh yeah, you can take a cut of their wages. It's fine. And it turns out the LLM was just kind of BSing because it's one of the things that the LLMs are good at. And if you can kind of go in with your head up, other adage, Beth Rudden, who's been on the show a bunch, gave me this one is, AI is great if you're already wise. So like
Yeah.
once you know how to use it, it's badass. But how do we get people to that place? And, you're dealing mainly with college age folks, adults to a large extent, young adults. But even, I have a 5-year-old, how do we think about bringing them on board and what's the right timeline? What are the developmental stages? I like the way you were talking about Bloom's taxonomy. How do you think about when folks are ready for the next level of engaging with these tools Really fascinating stuff. I'm going to hold up the book for the video folks out there. It's Teaching with AI, a practical guide to a new era of human learning. I'm here with Eddie Watson. It's been a wonderful conversation so far. We're getting closer to time. I do want to make sure I ask the question of like, how do you stay on top of things? Any tips for our listeners? You're someone who's staying ahead of the curve in higher ed. You're a reluctant futurist or whatever the appropriate adjective would be, but how do you stay on top of things? Any advice for our listeners as far as how we can keep up and maybe not get too shook by the rate of change these days?
Well, I think I'm fortunate that it's part of my job, that it's just part of what I do every
Yeah.
day. Certain vehicles that I connect with, I've followed and connected with a lot of people that are thought leaders within the AI space, really within LinkedIn. And so there's
Yep.
just a sort of a large amount of information that pops up there every time that there's a new study, because certainly the research within this space around generative AI is just emerging. So,
Yeah.
we're just sort of learning how people are using it, and like the whole notion of learning outcomes and how it helps student achievement. That is, it takes a while to bring such research through to fruition. But the stuff's starting to pop up, and so that is one of the key mechanisms that I kind of plug in with. I'm in the process of building a new institute on AI pedagogy and the curriculum for
Mm-hmm.
the association where I work,
Yeah.
and we've brought together a team of experts for that. So I'm fortunate to be interacting with a lot of people who are engaging in a lot of the same thought as I am. There's some are ethicists, and some are policy experts, and some are teaching freshman writing, and some
Yeah.
were for university presidents. So it's a lot of different perspectives that's part of that community. But yeah, I would say that probably LinkedIn is one of the key pieces. But I have the Apple News app. I
Yeah.
have bring me articles, news from the popular press, I guess, regarding AI stories as they come. And every day there's dozens. So it's
Yeah.
another way to kind of keep track of things.
Yeah, it's always inspiring to me when folks who are within higher ed are omnivorous in their information sources and they're not just, over specializing perhaps in a discipline and the journals within that discipline and the leading thinkers talking to the leading thinkers. Because some of the critiques about the ivory tower silo element of academia, I think there's some value in being critical there, and that's why I think making those connections outside. I always want more academics and folks in higher ed to actually be on LinkedIn because it is. I think of it as it's a social platform, but it's really allows for more discussion. That is, people are there as their professional identities. So I think it keeps some of the trolling and some of the polarization kind of off the platform. But I'm
Right.
always looking for opportunities to make those types of connections. So I was happy you brought that up.
Yeah, it's funny. I still have an account on Twitter, and I don't go in there very often, but everything that I like on Twitter, it's always higher ed,
Yeah.
something from the Chronicle or a professor has noted. So that's my interactions.
Yeah.
But when I go to my feed, it's always like the craziest political stuff. And I'm
Yeah.
just like, the algorithm isn't even
Yeah.
listening to me anymore. It's just
Right.
feeding me stuff.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I'm rarely over there anymore, but LinkedIn is certainly where I seem to traffic whenever I'm on social media.
Yeah, I mean, the only dark patterns, if there are any, are like the for-profit commercialization, all of those
True.
challenges. But like any platform, anything, you go into it critically with some media savvy, hopefully you can kind of navigate and perform. That is really where, the mission, I guess, of higher ed around, creating citizens who are wise and able to engage in their communities and then also find professional outcomes that are favorable in their lives, allows for economic mobility, social mobility, all those kinds of things, very much baked into what you're providing here. We're pretty much at time here, Eddie, so I'd love to wrap up here with any parting thoughts, any takeaways for our listeners as they head back to the rest of their lives.
Yeah, I think that there's maybe three things that I would recommend. One being your best bet is to play with some of these things, to look at the different tools and recognize that it's iteration. Like if you ask your kid to do something and they didn't do it quite right, you would give it another set of instructions.
Yeah.
So no, there's iteration. You don't anticipate that it's going to get it right the first time. It just may
Hmm.
need more context.
Hmm.
So, you pose a question and then provide a lot of context. So you might end up writing 4 or 5 sentences. It's
Yeah.
definitely not a Google search. So recognize it's a different kind of interaction opportunity. Also, recognize that the free tools are not nearly as smart
Mm,
as the tools that you would subscribe to. In
mm,
fact, by design, ChatGPT, the free version, they dumbed it down when they
yeah,
launched the paid version.
right.
So there's a real degree of separation between what you'll get with the free version
Yeah.
versus what you'll get with the paid version.
Another losing trend in our March Madness was and shitification, which is a shout out to Cory Doctorow, who's talked about that on platforms, but it also didn't win, not surprisingly. It's not that exciting. But it is like there be dragons out there, and if you can get behind the paywall for these AIs, they're becoming much more mistake proof. They basically again raise the floor and also raise the ceiling. Like you can start to do new and interesting things with them.
Yeah, and so from a faculty perspective, those in higher education, I think it's an essential tool that, in the same way that higher ed will pay for your Microsoft
Mm.
365 subscription
Mhm.
so that you can have Microsoft Word to do your research and to create a syllabus and all of that.
Yeah.
I think we're at a point that faculty require
Mm.
access to at least one paid version
Mm.
of an AI to, number one, know what the most affluent of your students, those that are subscribing, to know what they're getting so that you can post your assignment in and see what the latest, greatest AI will produce in response to your assignment so that you can maybe
Mm.
rethink things. It is a required teaching tool
Mm.
going forward. So if there are administrators that are watching right now, I think just sort of embracing it. We're and right now, at least on the calendar, we are in budget season in higher
Yeah.
education. Place money. It's not, it's $20 a month.
Yeah. Right.
Just do the 20 times 12 times the number of faculty in your department and budget
Yeah.
for that to
Mhm.
enable them to not be blindsided by what might be taking place within their courses.
Love it. Amazing stuff here with C. Edward Watson. Eddie Watson wrote a really interesting book. I definitely recommend it to our listeners. It's called Teaching with AI, a practical guide to a new era of human learning. Eddie, it was wonderful having you on the show. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you for having me. This has been a lot of fun.
And for our listeners, hopefully you enjoyed what you heard. We'll include links to what we talked about in the show notes for the episode. Remember to subscribe, write us reviews, tell your friends about this amazing conversation and conversations like it. We'll be back again soon. This is Trending in Education.